For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Anish Sahoni, and I'm the Executive Director of Teach for America here in Chicago and Northwest Indiana. Thank you so much for coming out on a Monday morning. When we were planning this event, I was wondering, is Monday morning a good idea or a bad idea? You never know. I think a good idea because you haven't done too much yet this week to distract you from the focus. So we really appreciate you prioritizing this. I also want to extend a special thank you to our partners at the McCormick Foundation and to Cornelia for agreeing to moderate this panel. This is an incredibly important conversation, and at Teach for America, we were inspired and really moved to co-host this conversation because we fundamentally believe in the importance and power of early childhood education. Just recently, about a month ago, the National Assessment for Educational Progress released its latest round of assessment results. And as for those of you that are familiar with the assessment, it's considered to be a gold standard assessment. And in part, it's because it's given to a random sample of 4th and 8th graders across different content areas, and you can't really prepare or study for the test or the assessment. Some of you may also remember that this assessment was the basis of a 2017 study that came out of Stanford that showed that Chicago public schools were the fastest improving urban school system in the country. We should all be proud of those results, and let's take a second to applaud. At the same time, I truly believe that the best work happens when you're learning from those who are pace setters. And the 2019 results were a little more sobering for Chicago. Across most subject areas and content areas, Chicago's progress was pretty flat. Yet there were some bright spots across the country, and one district and one state in particular. In 2009, DC public schools, a decade ago, embarked on an ambitious initiative to roll out universal pre-K for all 3- and 4-year-olds. In 2017, 9 out of 10 4-year-olds in DC and 7 out of 10 3-year-olds in DC were enrolled in public pre-K. In the last decade, Mississippi has taken on an incredibly important early literacy initiative. This success and this progress of this initiative has catapulted Mississippi to being the fastest improving state in our country across all content and subject areas. Mississippi. DC is the only district that has made faster progress over the last decade than Chicago. So for all the researchers in the room, I want to be clear, anecdote does not equal causation. But the research is on our side as well. It is uncontested that high quality early childhood opportunity for all has immense social and economic benefits for our country, for our students, and for their families. At Teach for America, we're a network of 3,400 members who all start their career through classroom teaching and go on to make an impact, continuing on as teachers, school leaders, civic leaders, and more. And what I am especially proud of our work is the way we have translated our belief in early childhood education into action. For more than a decade, we have supported the next generation of classroom teachers to get their start in early childhood classrooms. In partnership with National Louis University, just last year, we brought in nearly 25 new early childhood pre-K teachers to our city. Of course, our work doesn't stop there. We support our alumni to continue on their impact as teachers, school leaders, civic leaders, and more. And take, for example, 2 of our panelists. We'll start with Kelly. Kelly began her career as an early childhood educator, worked on staff at Teach for America, and co-founded an organization named VOCEL, where she now serves as executive director. Or Michael. Michael also started as an early childhood educator, served in a number of school leadership roles, and was most recently CPS's Chief of Early Childhood Education. I am incredibly proud of the work that TFA does in this space, but we have to be honest that it takes a number of organizations and a number of individuals. It takes critical partners like Cornelia and Mario. It takes all of you being invested in this topic, because we can't do it alone. Chicago is at a critical moment in time. Last year, only a quarter of Chicago students were ready for kindergarten across, or fully ready for kindergarten across all areas. Chicago is in a very nascent part of its rollout of its own universal pre-K system. And so there's a lot for us to learn in these early days as we seek to continuously improve our work. I'm not necessarily the expert on these topics, but these four are. And so I am incredibly excited to turn it over to Cornelia to moderate our panel and to continue the conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Anish. I am Education Director at the McCormick Foundation, and we are very proud to support TFA in both contributing to the pipeline of diverse, really well-trained early childhood teachers. It's said that Chicago, if we keep on the track for UPK, needs 1,500 new early childhood teachers in the next 3 years. And that's actually the low end of the estimate. It could be anywhere from 1,500 to 4,500, depending on when you take into account attrition and churn and retirement. So we have a big challenge, and we're also proud to support not only the pipeline aspects of well-trained teachers, but also the number of your alums who go into leadership positions, such as we see represented on this panel, so thank you. The McCormick Foundation has been investing in early childhood system building in Illinois for over 25 years. And so we've been very focused on statewide system building, policy and advocacy. I see a lot of folks that we partner with in this room who are incredible leaders. And in the last couple of years, we've really focused we've invested a lot more in Chicago just because of the promise of universal preschool that we thought was important to make sure it was rolled out smoothly. And so we had a number of grants here and there. Just a quick recap, and I know Anish gave, and this is, I'm a former journalist, so there will be some editorial commentary in here, and you may correct me if I get any of this wrong, but just a quick recap to make sure that we're all on the same page. So in 2018, former Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced universal preschool for Chicago, where he wanted all 4-year-olds basically cared for, most 4-year-olds cared for in school-based settings in CPS, and then birth to 3, he de-emphasized this part, but the early learning chief at the time said, well, I want to take this as an opportunity to then really build up the birth to 3 system in the community-based programs. So that more or less was the plan, and as he was wont, this is my editorial comment, he would announce something and then tell his staff to go implement. And so they had to scramble to figure out how to implement this very quickly, and it was a major restructuring of the entire system. But this is the way many cities and even states are going now, where they're 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds are being cared for in pre-K, high-quality pre-K settings in school-based settings. So Oklahoma, Georgia, Washington, D.C., New York City, Boston. This is sort of the trend, and some of the research bears out what the results are, the outcomes are for children, which is not to say there aren't high-quality community-based settings that are more appropriate and better for families. So the problem is scaling that, doing that at scale. So this was the plan, and then one of the major vehicles for this restructuring came about this summer, where it was an RFP of distributing $200 million to try to right-size the community-based organizations and make them whole, increase their reimbursement rates, which were far lower than what school-based settings would get, while trying to build out the school-based classrooms starting with areas in the south and west sides that needed it the most. Is that more or less? Okay, so Michael will correct me in a minute, but I think that was, and then there was a lot of, let's just say it didn't go so smoothly this summer, and in the distribution of the RFP. And again, total editorial comment. What happened was that many of the high-quality community-based organizations that had long-time track records and evidence of quality, NACE accreditation, Accelerate Gold standards, such as Mario's program, they got cut. A number of other community-based programs that were, foundational in the communities. They got cut. And oversight seemed to be quality and questions about quality settings. And so they diversified the types of programs. So there were a lot of more Humpty Dumpty daycares that were receiving, that didn't necessarily have quality ratings, that received funding. And some of the traditional, really proven programs got cut. So anyway, that is totally my editorial commentary on that. I am going to, let me start on a happy note with all of you, just to ease into that after that dispiriting one. And let me go ask each of you to tell the personal story about how you got involved in early childhood and sort of what your trajectory was, very briefly. And also, we're just going to talk for a half hour, but we want to leave a good half hour for conversation with you, because I know everyone in this room is going to have, they're going to have great questions. So, Kelly, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Good morning. Thank you so much, TFA, and everyone for having me. I'm Kelly Powers. I am the co-founder and executive director of VOCEL, and I really have Teach for America to thank for my entree into early childhood. I was a 2007 core member. I taught in Ferguson in St. Louis, and I taught first and second grade, actually. I'd had a small stint teaching pre-K during my summer training. Loved my teaching experience, but Chicago is home for me, so I came back here in 2009 and began working on the Chicago regional team as a program director, or MTLD, teacher coach for core members, and was asked at that point to support a cohort of all pre-K teachers. And I see some folks in the room that were in those cohorts over the years. But it was really that experience, being in classrooms with 3 to 5-year-olds and working with teachers and seeing the power of those earliest years, that I guess I would say I kind of got bit by the pre-K bug, and haven't really looked back since then. During my time on staff, where I was with Michael and then also my co-founder Jesse, who's here as well, we had the great opportunity to actually overhaul the training and development for all early childhood core members. And so that started here in Chicago and subsequently was rolled out at other Teach for America institutes across the country. Through that experience, just worked with really amazing organizations that were doing research on early language acquisition, thinking about child development more holistically, and again, learning that just really kind of pulled me into this space and made it a place that I want to be. For the past 7 years, I've now been leading VOCEL. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that works with young children and the adults in environments that support them. So we focus on children birth through 5. Here in the city, our core program, the Child Parent Academy, is a 2-generational model that works with young kids birth through 3 and their parents. So we're actually kind of the precursor to kids going into the UPK classrooms at the 4-year-old pre-K level. And then we're also doing some exciting pilot work that I think I'll talk about later with CPS related to the UPK rollout.
Great. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Michael LaBelle. I was formerly Chief for Early Childhood Education in Chicago Public Schools. I got my start in early childhood by accident. I was a finance major at the University of Illinois. I applied to Teach for America at the very last minute, on the very last deadline, not really knowing what to expect. I thought it was a cool program and was really interested in the mission and vision. And I remember, this is a story I've shared often, but I remember getting my acceptance letter, and logically I thought I was going to be a high school math teacher, finance major, high school math, and I remember getting my acceptance letter. It said, congratulations, you'll be teaching in Chicago, early childhood education. I was like, I don't know what that is. Let's figure this out. And that was really everything since that point, as you can see today, it really has changed my life. I was a preschool teacher on the south side of Chicago, district in which I graduated from. I taught all 3-year-olds. I remember my first day in the classroom, I had 33 3-year-olds. That's what I walked into on day 1. I remember calling my mom crying. I was like, I don't know what to do. Logically, again, Chicago Public Schools had asked me to lead that department one day, which doesn't really add up, but it worked out. So I absolutely loved my experience in the classroom, and very similar to Kelly, I knew within the first really couple weeks that this was my career. I, like so many other TFAers, thought I was going to be in the core for 2 years and then figure out the next steps in my career. And very quickly, I knew education, specifically early childhood, is where I wanted to be. I was in the classroom, as Kelly mentioned, joined Teach for America staff as an early childhood coach. and went into school leadership. I was an assistant principal for a couple years, worked with Kristen Munoz, who was one of the teachers at Casals, a school that I was an assistant principal at. I was principal at Piccolo for 5 years. And also I want to give a shout out to Emily Simon. Emily was one of the teachers that I worked with as a coach. So you can see like all of the connections, which is just really cool. Emily also works on the early childhood staff in Chicago Public Schools. So just I'm one story, Kelly's one story. There are thousands of others across the country, which is a point that I want to make today. But I was a principal for 5 years on the west side at a school called Piccolo. It was just an amazingly remarkable experience. And then I was asked to step into the early childhood chief role about 13 months ago, a role that I've recently transitioned from. But Chicago Public Schools, specifically early childhood, is obviously very near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited about some of the things that we're doing to improve on the system.
And Michael, where are you going next?
Good question. So I've recently accepted a position with a new startup called the Bezos Day One Fund. The goal of the startup is to open up early learning centers across the country in low-income community areas that currently don't have any access to pre-K. And so we're focusing on areas where there's tremendous access needs, and it is literally a ground-up organization. So we're really excited about really providing high-quality pre-K opportunities to those who currently don't have them.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Well, good morning. My name is Mario Perez. I'm the Executive Director of El Hogar de Niño. It's our early childhood center in Pilsen. I've been there for about 7 years. My path to early childhood is nonlinear. I worked in government. I was a policy advisor for a governor in Colorado, which is where I grew up. Was in the military for a while as an air traffic controller. I was a management consultant at IBM for many years, and then transitioned to El Hogar de Niño as a grant writer. Through a series of different events and transitions, the board asked if I would serve as interim. Which I was hesitant to do because there was a lot of turmoil at the time, and I thought I didn't know if we could make it work. But I am sort of like a moth to a flame when it comes to challenges, and I just couldn't resist. There's something very visceral about that for me, and problem solving. So I raised my hand and said I would serve, and I love it. I love this work. I love everything about it. Every day, even with the present challenges, I get to have an impact and work with parents and families and see them move. One of our parents is here today who is just an inspiring story. So that's sort of my background in terms of how I got to El Hogar de Niño. In terms of my relationship with Teach for America, we have a strong partnership. When Teach for America had core members in early childhood centers, community-based centers, at one point, we think we had 5 of our 6 preschool classrooms had TFA core members. Some were core and some were in their 3rd. I think one even did a 4th year, if I'm not mistaken. So, and we really enjoyed the relationship there. Really was great to see young, vibrant, energetic, smart folks come in and really try to run classrooms. And so we built a special orientation program to help indoctrinate our Teach for America folks, because to give them really direct interaction with families right off of the bat so that they were successful on day one. So that's something that I was really proud of in our time that we worked with Teach for America. So.
Great, thank you. So could, before we get into some of the UPK stuff, yes, okay. Talk a little bit about the actual work that you're doing and what your goals are. What outcomes are you trying to focus on? And Michael, let's start with you. If you can talk about, this is the perfect time for you to, you can be completely honest about everything. But talk about you spent 13 months sort of developing a vision, your vision for early childhood in CPS. Talk about that just so we can glean the learnings from that and understand that. And then I'd like Mario and Kelly for you to talk about sort of what are you trying to achieve in your programs? Are you trying to expand? I know you're doing some work with principals. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I will be very honest. I think one of the most important things to know about the vision that we had set from a Chicago Public Schools perspective is that we approached our work through really a holistic system lens. One of the most important things that I felt that I could do in my role was to advocate on what was needed and best for the system as a whole, not just for Chicago Public Schools. We have to understand first and foremost, that when we're talking about universal pre-K or when we're talking about quality services or workforce or compensation, that these are questions that pertain to the early childhood ecosystem, not just Chicago Public Schools. And what was most important in my role is that we thought about expansion efforts, we thought about quality, that we thought about access through a system lens. The reality is Chicago Public Schools represents a very large portion of the early childhood kind of services in Chicago, but it does not represent most of those services that are happening in birth through 3, and it doesn't represent a lot of those services that are being offered for 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds as well. And so what was really important for us is that we had a vision that really captured our role in that system, and that we thought about our strategies and initiatives through that system lens. So I would just share that from our perspective, our vision was to, first and foremost, to provide access to quality early childhood education opportunities. And when we say early childhood, we're talking about starting at birth. I think that's a really common question that I get. What do you mean by early childhood education? CPS does not provide a lot of program opportunities for students from birth through 3, but we have several outstanding community-based agencies like El Hogada who do. And so we really need to understand how we collaborate, how we partner, and how we look at the decisions we make through that system lens. So birth through 2nd, 3rd grade, there's up for debate in terms of how you want to define early childhood, but our role was to increase access, increase quality opportunities for students in that age group. So for example, this past year, through some of the expansion efforts, we were able to, from a systems perspective, increase the number of seats to 4-year-olds by 1,400, which is, that's 1,400 students who are currently in a program who were not in a program last year, which is fantastic. When you think about the number of kindergartners that are in Chicago Public Schools, it's roughly 24,000. So increasing the number of 4-year-olds in pre-K across the city by 1,400 is no small feat. Now we still have a long way to go, not only from a 4-year-old perspective, but from a birth through 3 perspective. But the most important part of this vision is that we're working collaboratively with schools, with community agencies to really strengthen that system and to continue to increase access, but make sure each of those opportunities for students and families is one that's high quality.
So the current number, is it 14,000 is the total number of kids in preschool?
Approximately.
In school-based preschool today in Chicago, and you're trying to get to 24,000?
Yeah, the goal is to provide access to what we know to be true, and you alluded to this in your opening comments, Anish, is that when students receive high quality full day preschool, and I would even argue birth through 3 services, that that growth and that success tends to follow them through 3rd grade and beyond. And so our goal is to provide access to those who don't have it. To continue to grow that access to provide every child an opportunity. So whatever that number ends up being, I think right now we have some data points that suggest that it's around that 24,000 mark from at least an individual age group perspective that we're able to do so.
Mario, why don't we go to you, talk about what you're trying to achieve.
Well, a lot of the work that we do at El Hogar de Niño is really focused around the entire family. And so while we work with the spectrum from birth, we just opened 2 infant classrooms all the way to age 12, because we also have an after-school program. What we know for fact, and also anecdotally, but also with research, is for every investment that you make inside the classroom in those children and teachers, if those children are going back to a home environment that is not supportive, that investment diminishes significantly. So because of that, we work, in our case, with the most vulnerable populations. And there's a checklist when you come into our center, whether you are homeless, whether your child has special needs, whether you are a victim of domestic violence. Many of our clients check all of those boxes, right? That's the population we serve. So our mission has also changed in that special needs has grown significantly from about 10 to 15% of our population to about 60 right now. We don't have the bandwidth to support that, but it's a critical need. So we focus on family. Special needs is a big population, a big area of work for us. I would say the second part to that question is since the announcement of Universal Pre-K, we've really been trying to retool our organization so that we can adjust and adopt more of the 0 to 3 classrooms. That was sort of the expectation. So, and then given the way that things have sort of rolled out, that's shifted the expectation a bit. So.
And how many children and families do you serve?
We serve just under 400 total between school age, from birth to school age, as well as some of our family child care homes.
In which neighborhood are you located?
We're single site, so we have one center in Pilsen, but we serve the spectrum from all the way from Midway up to just short of the downtown area. So I think what happens is because of where we're located, families traverse across the city to go to work, and because of our long-standing reputation, they continue to come to our agency. Yeah.
Kelly.
Great. So VOCEL's ultimate purpose is really thinking about how do we help ensure that every young child has the foundation they need to learn, to grow, and to lead. So our name actually stands for Viewing Our Children as Emerging Leaders. So we're really thinking about that early leadership at the youngest age. But what we know is that you can support the child, but it also is critically important to support the adults that are surrounding them. So parents, caregivers, teachers, and principals. And so to answer your question about vision for our work, I mean, we're a relatively young organization. We're in our 6th year of programming right now. And the vision is to be able to expand our impact across the city. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. So I mentioned our core program is our Child Parent Academy, which is a 2-generational model that works with young children birth through 3, and that parent or caregiver. We operate 15 different cohorts across the city. This year we'll work with 300 young children and their parents and caregivers in this early learning accelerator that not only boosts preschool readiness, so when kids are transitioning into the UPK classrooms at 4 years old, they're that much more ready, but also how do we support the adult to understand child development, to help them have a community of support from other parents so they're not in this alone. And we found that to be really transformational in communities in terms of the feedback that we receive from parents, but also the feedback that we receive from principals. So when Michael was leading Piccolo as the principal, he was actually our first school partner back in 2016, I think. And we would talk about how parents who were engaging in VOCEL's program were also the parents showing up at his PAC meetings, getting more engaged in the school. So that 2-generational piece is really kind of a critical component of how VOCEL thinks about our ultimate theory of change. But we know that it's not just parent and caregiver, and so I think with the UPK rollout, we've had an interesting opportunity with support from the Chicago Public Education Fund and then partnering with CPS to think about VOCEL's core competency around adult learning. How do we leverage that in partnership with CPS? And so we have a pilot that's taken off this year to support 10 principals across the city who have pre-K in their buildings to help them think about their vision for excellence in pre-K classrooms and then do some job-embedded coaching that really will be tailored and individualized to the specific principal so they can think about how to best support their pre-K teachers. And we've been really fortunate to work with Anna and her team at the fund. The research that they had done, being an organization that works exclusively with principals, when we look at elementary school principals, they often tend to have more experience in the upper grades and Michael might be a little bit of an anomaly having taught pre-K and then leading a school. They may not have as much knowledge and experience in the lower grades, and so VOCEL can come in and really build that knowledge, build that skill, and help them set a vision for what true excellence in those earliest years will look like, knowing that it's going to pay dividends in the end, which all the research shows.
And just adding to that, preschool is voluntary. So it is not, you are not mandated to be in preschool. And just to reemphasize the point that there are many principals who really don't fully understand developmentally appropriate practice in the earlier years and how it's important to learn through play. And we've seen this around the state that often it's very much, I'm sure it's not in CPS, but a lot of direct instruction and drill and kill so that they can meet their 3rd grade benchmarks. But we do know that when done, when you incorporate play-based learning and developmentally appropriate practice, you can actually have much longer term learning gains. Okay, so let's jump into, can we jump into UPK, how that went? Michael, let's start with you. What are the good things that are going on, and what are some of the challenges as this gets rolled out?
Yeah, I would say that number one, the first good thing that I would share is that we have more students in early childhood programs than we have ever. So that is, when you think about the impact that that will have, it could be life-changing for some. And so I would say that what's going well is that we have more children in programs, both CPS programs and community-based organizations, than we have before, and that is incredibly exciting. I would say that from a partnership and collaboration perspective, we work very closely, CPS works very closely with the Department of Family and Support Services and City Hall to really ensure that any big decisions, any large initiatives like expansion that take place in the city are done collaboratively, and that are done so thinking about that systems perspective. A couple of things that I would mention in terms of what's next and things that we're prioritizing. Number one, we want to make sure that we are removing barriers to access for students and families. One of the biggest complaints that we get system-wide is this application system is a little bit tricky to manage and to understand. So collaboratively, we're working very closely with our partners to really determine what changes we can make, both short and long term, to make program opportunities more accessible to families. If there are seats, families should know about them, and we should reduce barriers to getting into those programs. That's number one. I think number two, as Cornelia mentioned, we know workforce is going to continue to be a huge priority for the system, not only for CPS, but again, for that system's perspective. We know that the reality is CPS preschool teachers are part of the Chicago Teachers Union and make more money, work fewer hours, shorter year, and receive, in many cases, better benefits than the traditional community-based preschool teacher. And that's a reality that we have to understand. We have to advocate to level the playing field as much as possible, not only to protect our community-based partners, but because we know it's right? Because we know that these teachers who are teaching one-year-old children, two-year-old children are teachers, and arguably, from my very biased opinion, are the most important teachers we have, right? And so we really need to make sure that, again, whether I'm in CPS or wherever, that we are continuing to advocate for things to make the workforce conversation, elevated in many ways. So workforce access, continue to think about expansion. Where and how we expand is very important. Thinking about how we do so to make sure that seats are filled. We don't want to just expand to expand, but we want to prioritize community areas and families who need this service the most, and then continuing to expand from there. But again, as I emphasized in my opening statements, doing so collaboratively, because we want to make sure that, traditional CPS program runs for 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, I'm sorry. And the reality is that might not be enough for some families. We might not be able to provide the holistic wraparound services that a community-based agency might. So the reality is this mixed delivery model is incredibly important to the success of universal preschool. And so I emphasize that again because as we are considering expansion, we need to do so, again, collaboratively, step by step, hand in hand with the Department of Family Support Services and our community-based partners.
Thank you. Mario, tell us about how this rollout has impacted you.
Well, I think first let me just say, I think the vision of universal pre-K, higher quality, more access, more children being served is a great one. And I think it's one that myself and all of my colleagues back and support. I think the execution is incredibly important. And from my understanding, in other communities, cities where UPK has been successful, transparency and a level playing field have been critical elements to success. I think that for many reasons, transparency has lagged in this process for us, and I think that has translated it into some hardship for a lot of community-based organizations. So some organizations are closing. We're closing a couple of classrooms most likely at the end of December, unless we can get some extended funding. And so that's micro. We're still talking community, but at a systems level, I think The top line results are great, right? There's more dollars and there are more slots. I think there's 1,600 more slots. Was it like, I think it represents 7% increase, as well as a 34% increase in dollars. That's good. So top line's great. As you dig down deeper, you start to see why there's been so much conversation of people about universal pre-K. In 2019, I don't have the CPS perspective, but just from the DFSS perspective, there are about 34, 35 entities that also have sites, right? So like we're one, we have one site in terms of, we have a family child care home, so we'd count as two. There are 298 sites in 2019 providing service, right? So of those, there were 3,400 slots that were lost or changed, right, between those providers in 2019 to 2020. And so that starts to give you some sense of why there's so much impact. There was a slight increase in dollars between 2019 and 2020, but that loss in slots is destabilizing at the end of the day. So from a community standpoint, our infrastructure cost is still the same. Our mortgage is the same. Salaries are the same. Our infrastructure is exactly as it was, but we're working with less. And so that, as a whole, when you look at the entire community, is destabilizing. I think Michael's point is really great, which is this is an ecosystem, and how do we start to think about what's the next step? How do we work together forward so that we're building partnerships? I think the work that Kelly's doing is really fabulous. Trying to build partnerships between community-based organizations and CPS, and working with principals to make sure that they really understand early education. So I could talk for a whole hour on this, so I'm going to just stop.
Can I add one
Yeah,
comment?
of
So I would just share that, and I appreciate everything you shared. I think that part of what's really important to understand, I think sometimes these things get merged together in ways that they shouldn't, meaning expansion and the RFP process within the DFSS. And so these things are related in some ways, but in many ways they're not. And so when we talk about changing of seats or losing of seats, in most of those cases, if not in all of those cases, those seats lost are not necessarily a product of CPS expanding or other programs expanding. And that's a really important note to make, because we don't want people, I specifically don't want people to confuse the closing of centers or sites or the loss of seats being a product of CPS expanding. In fact, when we forecasted our expansion efforts, we accounted for community-based agencies serving the same student population, same number of students. Now, it gets far more complicated than that when we're talking about co-pay and other things of that nature. But the RFP process that community-based agencies went through was in many ways separate from the expansion process itself. Now, there are some important layers to consider, like community-based agencies transitioning more to serving more birth through 3, and CPS transitioning to serving more 4, which is another conversation, a whole other panel to have. But those things in many ways are also separate. And so I think that's just an important distinction to make.
It's complicated, for sure. Very complicated, yeah.
In fact, that I think is one of the big challenges of the whole early childhood field, is just the sheer complexity of it. There's so many different funding streams and different models, and it's voluntary, and ensuring that it's not just a complete morass for families who are trying to access quality care, or the right kind of care for their child, is one of the greatest challenges. So let me ask about quality, and so that is the make or break factor for early childhood. You can extend access to everybody, but if it's not high quality, it doesn't have the kinds of effects that we all talk about, the long-term effects. So, and we only have to look at Florida, the state of Florida, which did universal pre-K, I think in 2005, and they did it on the cheap. I think they spent $2,200 a child, and it was a disaster. And even the founders of that acknowledged it was a disaster. And so making sure that and Mario, there are various indicators of quality. There's, we have an Accelerate program quality and continuous improvement system called Accelerate, and you're gold rated, which is, we have various other class scores that get inside the classroom, what the environments are, the quality of instruction, NACE accreditation. So talk about the importance of how you expand access in school-based and change, restructure, and also expand in community-based while maintaining quality and the professional development infrastructure that you need, and mental health supports and family support specialists and all of that, and whether we can do that not necessarily on the cheap. And one more piece of context. At the statewide level, there's been some recent cost modeling, as there was for the city, which I think predicted that it would cost about $175, $180 million a year to get the kind of quality universal system. Is that about right, Michael?
I think so.
Okay. And at the statewide level, there are figures that show we have a $1.5 billion system, and what we really need is a $10 billion system. So we have half of our early childhood teachers, mostly the ones in community-based settings, who make about 47% in the state, who make little enough that they qualify for public benefits. So they are moonlighting as Lyft drivers and working at Target, and that is just not a strong enough system. So compensation is a huge deal. But Kelly, talk to us about quality and sort of that. You're focusing a lot on that.
Yes, we definitely are. But I will say, because we are not a traditional child care program anymore, and folks who have followed VOSEL for a number of years know that we did operate a child care program initially, and so we're looking at things like class and different evaluation measures. And as a young organization that frankly had the opportunity to be nimble as UPK was rolling out, we made a choice to actually double down on our efforts with our two-generational approach, knowing that there were quality CBOs and that expansion for UPK was going to be happening at the district. But despite the fact that we are not required to use those evaluation systems in our programs, we are constantly thinking about quality. It is in our DNA to track and measure our outcomes, both with our children and our parents, and soon to be the principals that we're working with as well. But we are kind of at this interesting point where VOSEL is not an evidence-based program, but it's science-based and evidence-informed. And so we are constantly looking at kind of the top players in the country and the research that they're doing, specifically around this two-generational, so caregiver and young child. What are the adult kind of executive functions and capabilities that need to be present to best support a young child, and making sure that those things are embedded into our program. And so we actually have a partnership with, through Harvard's Graduate School of Education. They have a center that is doing this research, and they also have a portfolio called Frontiers of Innovation that we've been fortunate enough to work with over the past 6 months, and will continue through the rest of this school year, to really refine our evaluation model within our program, and make sure that we're tracking and measuring the right things that are going to really help us continue to refine our program and make sure that it is truly delivering on its promise to kids and families. But what I really appreciate about the partnership with Harvard, and I would strongly suggest anyone interested in this check out the Center on the Developing Child, their position is that a randomized control trial, or being evidence-based, is not necessarily the be-all, end-all. We need to be using iterative design processes to really think about how we're meeting community need and demand. As I mentioned before, VOSEL is in, we have 15 sites that we operate in. It's in 13 different community areas across the city, and the west side is different than the south side, and it's different than the southwest side, and we need to adapt for the needs of our kids and families. And I see a parent nodding, which is just like music to my ears, but we really need to be responsive, and I think that is how we think about quality. So, play-based, all the things you said, developmentally appropriate. We do extensive teacher professional development in-house. And for us, being, I guess I'm a little bit in a different position than Michael and Mario up here, where we have a little bit more flexibility, but we are thinking about how do we bring that quality piece to the work that we're doing. So our pilot with CPS, that's really the point, is to bring that perspective on best practice to principals.
Mario, do you have any?
Yeah.
And then we'll go to questions.
Sure. Okay. Well, your question, fundamentally is the one that keeps me up late at night. How do you do more with less? How do you have high quality when you have limited means? Quite frankly, that's why I fell in love with El Hogar de Niño, watching our parents, who I could identify with, come in, pick up their kids. They're tired, they're weary. They're clearly, and a lot of our teachers reflect the socioeconomic status of our teachers as well, or of our parents. And so it's a very unique community. We have all of the markers of quality: Accelerate, NACE accredited, et cetera. Some of it's mission, finding the right people. I think in a world of scarce resources, probably some of the answer is in strong partnerships, right? Sort of economies of scale to some degree, partnering with other organizations where there's communication, sharing of data and information. I would love a system, for example, where we were able to track our children when they went into CPS and share data upstream and downstream, right? And track the progress longitudinally over time. But that's a hard ask for whatever, or it's an easy ask, it's a hard thing to get done. I've asked many times. So that's one idea for how to do more with less. But I'll
Just so
leave
you
it
know,
there, yeah.
there are discussions going on about how
great.
to integrate the data
Okay.
systems and improve them, and so that you can actually ask substantive questions of them and be better informed on how you make policy decisions. Michael, do you have anything?
That's a big initiative that is currently being discussed. Is how do we make our information systems more cohesive so that there isn't this disconnect between the services that a child and family receives at one point in their life in the same city, public agency when they transition to the next. There shouldn't be this loss of information. So I think that's something that I think collaboratively the city is trying to take on. Quality is the question, right? So we're not increasing access without quality is a terrible goal, right? And so when we talk about increasing access, it's increasing access to high quality programs, and there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle. My Stephanie Cohen, who is our director of program, is here in Chicago Public Schools. So if I leave any part of this out, she's kind of my go-to. So I'm going through our strategic plan as we speak. So a few things that are really top of mind when we think about quality. Number one, we need to understand that principals have a lot of impact on what happens in a school, and that we need to make sure that principals are equipped to lead their early childhood programs, pre-K through second grade. So it is part of our goal to train, to educate, to provide professional development to school leaders, both before they step into the principal role and while they're in the principal role, to ensure that they're equipped with the skills necessary to lead these programs in a highly effective way. That is not an easy task. A few notes that I would make. I went through 2 principal preparation programs. I didn't have a class on early childhood education. Again, I think this was alluded to, but I'm somewhat of a unicorn. You don't see principals who are former pre-K teachers. That also just generally doesn't happen. And so our responsibility to train principals who are leading these programs is huge. So that's one piece. We also want to make sure that we are also able to educate school-based staff and the public on the quality of the programs themselves. This is something that you and I have discussed quite a bit, but we want to make sure that we're able to share out different data that's relevant to programs so that parents and the public know about the quality programs that exist in the city. So that's another big piece. No one's more important than the people on the front line, which is teachers. And so we really also need to make sure that there's a pipeline to hire new teachers every year, regardless of whether the city's growing or not. We need to make sure that we're able to provide them adequate professional development and training and supports throughout the course of the year. That makes up the biggest part of our work, is making sure that we're supporting teachers on the ground. And that can be everything from curriculum to teaching practices to using data to inform instruction, all of these different pieces that make up teaching. And then the other piece, which are the more comprehensive wraparound services. So currently our program team in Chicago Public Schools is made up of a education support team, a family engagement team, and a team that we refer to as our comprehensive service team. These teams are really designed to provide schools with the supports that they need, to provide families with the supports that they ultimately need. So these wraparound services, creating family engagement plans that meet the community needs, that consider each community area, that considers the population of students that you're working with, partnering with nearby agencies or community centers to provide wraparound services that the school might not be able to provide, really diagnosing what the individual needs are for a school community and being able to support principals and teachers directly with being able to provide those services. So that really makes up the other big part of our work. So it's not only about instruction, but it's about really targeting schools who need support around family engagement and around providing these wraparound comprehensive services that really kind of encapsulate what we think about when we talk about quality.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to your questions.
Thanks. Really great conversation. A lot of the conversation this morning has seemed to be about the supply side. You know, how do we supply the resources and the human capital, the talent to deliver high quality? Could you tell us a little bit about the demand side? Because I'm cognizant of the fact that everybody isn't fully aware of how important early childhood education is, or some people may have logistical problems or administrative problems of getting and picking up and so forth. So if you know, we often think of the supply side as well. If we have enough resources to supply everybody, then we'll be all set. But is there demand from everybody? Or let me just ask you, what does the demand side of the equation look like?
Yeah, I could share from a city perspective. I think that Kelly and even yourself will have a better idea of what that looks like on the ground in individual community areas. But from a demand perspective, we have thousands of students on our wait list. Okay. So over 6,000 students currently on a wait list to get into a program. So the demand is there. That is a very large number. Now we've prioritized, again, collectively, lower income community areas that are higher need. And we've also prioritized expanding in ways that allow for access where that demand specifically is. And we use kindergarten enrollment as a proxy for that. So if we know that there are 100 kindergarten students in this community school, then we know generally there's probably, give or take, 100 4-year-olds, 100 3-year-olds, et cetera. And so we think about expansion in that way very strategically so that a family doesn't have to travel 5 miles, or if they choose to travel 5 miles, it's because they want to, or because that's where they work, or a program that they particularly enjoy. And so there is a huge demand there. And to be frank, if we were to attempt to fill that demand tomorrow, we couldn't. From a workforce perspective, from a dollars perspective, these are huge contingencies to being able to meet that demand, which is why there's more of a gradual phase into universal.
Yeah, I could share some of that from the ground level perspective. I think there's high demand. We're fully enrolled. We have a wait list. Most of the colleagues that I know, the other organizations, are also fully enrolled. And so when programs close, we're not sure where families are going. I think another component to that is trust. So in our case, you know, we're working with vulnerable populations, and so we work very hard, and it takes a lot of time and effort to build trust with families, particularly with home visiting, for example. So when you lose a program like home visiting, families don't really want to switch to another organization. So they'll opt out of the system as a whole. That's a huge problem. I think there's a philosophical and real question, like how many is too many? You know, what are acceptable growing pains? You know, the cost of doing business. For me, one is too many. But I'm on the ground. I have to look at our parents every day and work with them and make sure that their kids have service, right? And so from maybe a systems perspective, there might be a tolerable number, but demand is high. You know, when centers close, as they are starting to, or programs are closing quietly, I'm not sure where those children are going. And so it's been my sense, and it's interesting to hear you confirm, that the infrastructure just isn't there yet. So what does that mean for this program right now? Do we need to pause and slow it down so that children aren't lost as we continue to move forward? Or do we move forward at the same pace and just hope for the best?
I can share a slightly different perspective on the demand question. So just a quick anecdote, back in 2016, our Child Parent Academy actually evolved very organically based on parent demand. So we were running a small child care program at that point. We were fully enrolled also, and we had parents coming to us wanting to get on a wait list, but they also didn't necessarily all need full day care and education. And they couldn't necessarily access CPS because their child was too young, but also they didn't have the kind of 9-to-5 work schedule that they would be entering into a CBO like Mario's. And what we knew is that in more affluent communities, there tend to be a lot of opportunities for parent-child engagement. Music classes, mommy and me classes, those are ubiquitous in many communities. But in many under-resourced communities, programs like that don't exist. So to your question of do parents know the importance of this? I would say yes and no, but we had parents coming to us, and this is, again, is one anecdote, wanting their child to be in some type of early learning program, desiring to have that engagement and that opportunity. And what we found was that these were parents who were not going to qualify for home visiting because they weren't, I mean, one, we have limited home visiting and it's not going to cover all the kids and families, but they also didn't necessarily need or qualify for full day childcare. So how could we give them a different type of resource that not only would support their child, but would also support them as a parent? And, even though they weren't going to qualify for full day childcare, I often get asked, are the parents you work with working? Yes, they are. They're Lyft drivers, they're working odd shifts and overnights and things like that. So for them to engage with their child during the day actually is a really powerful experience for them.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm the lone parent in the room. And as I'm listening to just as everybody is like really trying to tackle this problem, and I thank you guys so much for meeting and really trying to get at the heart. But I have children who are, my oldest is 14 and my little one is 4. So, and I'm in Chicago Public Schools and I'm definitely involved in parent leadership. And this level playing field was something that was definitely one that I tuned into because as he mentioned with Mississippi, and I don't know if he understands what's happening in Mississippi, but let's just speak from the special education standpoint, how they provide resources and how do they look at people with disabilities. It's a different program than what's happening in the state of Illinois. I think the state of Illinois is number 48 or something like that, and Mississippi is up there like number 15. Yes, the state of Mississippi. So, so you have a system that's in place already where they're just doing things differently to be able to usher in universal pre-K. So what are we doing here in Illinois? There are some systems, things that are just not plausible for the implementation. And I don't even like the fact that we're being utilized as a guinea pig here in the city of Chicago. I have issues with that. We have so many issues and things that are happening in the city of Chicago, from the way things are set up politically, from the way that things are set up with our schools and just how much work we have to do, and the rollout is happening here. Why? Can you do the rollout somewhere in Glenview? I'm just saying. I mean, I think that, especially for where we are right now in the city of Chicago, in Chicago Public Schools, where we just had an investigation with everything with abuse, being able to just report abuse. There was no system in place for that. There was no system, the whole entire special education division was taken over by the state. You just keep on going down the list of all the things that we still have yet to work on. Why are you rolling out universal pre-K in this mess, in this climate? And I hear you when you say, Mr. in the middle, and you're on your way out. Good timing on that one, because there's so much. I'm actually going to be meeting with our head of the Office of Diverse Learners because I have children with disabilities, and I don't agree with the rollout of universal pre-K. And she did not even understand. She's an educator, and she's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Well, this is the most vulnerable. This is this what's happening at that young age. It's a very song and dance or this back and forth with children with disabilities because of the type of reporting, the type of data collection that's taking place at that age. And if you have a system that's dysfunctional, like right now, dysfunctional, you don't have the bodies in place, you're trying to find staff that doesn't want to work for CPS, you're trying to find parents, there's a huge issue with trust. And CPS is trying right now to build that trust with parents. It does not exist.
So can I jump in and
And I'm sorry, and I can sit on this forever.
So was it ill-timed?
Well, I think respectfully, I think you bring up a lot of points that I think are worth commenting on. I think first and foremost, the reality that, that nearly a couple thousand students are receiving services this year that wouldn't have had access otherwise is enough of a data point for me. And these are high quality services. These are services that they're receiving from a certified, credentialed teacher in a high quality program. I would respectfully just share that waiting to provide those services to those families would have been a tremendous disservice to those families. Just as a quick anecdote, so I was a preschool teacher, as I mentioned, and the reality is that just from my own classroom experience, and there are hundreds of examples like this, I could speak to what pre-K did for the students that I had in my classroom and those families. It really provided them a platform that they might not have had otherwise. It provided them a foundation that they might not have had otherwise. Again, I mentioned 33 3-year-olds who are all now in high school, and many of them are in some of the highest performing high schools in the city. Many of them, a couple of them were accepted to boarding programs, and these are students from the South Side. These are black students from the South Side of Chicago, all low-income families. And I would argue that pre-K laid a critical foundation for them that, again, I think we can't afford to wait on providing these opportunities if they are available. So I would just share that. I think second, one of the things that we've prioritized is making sure that any program that we open, at least from a CPS perspective, is one that is provides a safe, warm, welcoming environment, one that provides, again, a highly certified teacher in that classroom, and the resources, materials, and supplies needed to provide a healthy, successful environment. And that's something we've done in every single one of our classrooms. And so I'm very proud of the work that's been done from an expansion perspective. And again, what I would share is we've prioritized putting these programs in place in community areas where they're needed most. Nearly every single one of our programs was in a predominantly low-income community area serving families of color who, again, didn't necessarily have access to a program. And I would argue that for those families and for those children, that it could be potentially changing their lives. And I think we have enough data to suggest that it is. And so I think that it's important that we understand some of the challenges that exist in the system, that we work through some of those challenges, that we think about things like pacing in a way so that it doesn't disrupt the system as a whole. I've shared this time and time again, and I'll continue to scream it from the rooftops. I think the reality is we need to make sure that we are moving at a pace that doesn't cause programs to close, that doesn't cause programs to be run unsuccessfully or not as effective, to make these programs low quality. That is not acceptable. But I absolutely think that there's a path to continue to increase the access to high quality programs throughout the city of Chicago, where again, and perhaps they might not have as high of a need in terms of the population in Glenview, but the reality is that need is great in Chicago, and we need to continue to think about ways that we can increase the access to program opportunities while not disrupting the system in a way that could do irreparable damage. And so I think that's the best answer that I can provide. I think that there's a way to continue to increase access while making sure that we're protecting the system as a whole. And again, I'm really proud of the fact that 1,400, that is an enormous number, are receiving services this year that wouldn't have had them otherwise. And so, I think we need to continue to think about things in a way that protects the system, ensure it's high quality, but really proud on that front.
So I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative, if that's okay, to ask one lightning round last, one concrete, actionable piece of advice for Mayor Lori Lightfoot on how to improve the system. Going back to what Anish said at the beginning, that we're still only a quarter of our kids are showing up at kindergarten, fully demonstrating readiness in early math, early literacy, and social emotional skills. One piece of critical advice. Kelly, go ahead.
I'll say mine is like the outsider from CPS and a CBO, but I do think this collaboration between the systems, between CPS and DFSS, the city and CPS coming together, because our families need the wraparound supports. We can do high quality pre-K, but we really need to thinking about holistic supports for children and families. That's why we have doubled down on the 2-generational approach. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing that I would add is the fact that we still have 6,000 students on a wait list, right? And so I think that we need to continue to approach this system, treating it as a system, treating Chicago Public Schools, DFSS, and our community-based partners as critical pieces to that puzzle. Thinking about any changes that we make or any decisions that we make through that holistic system lens. But to also recognize that there is ample data to suggest that if students receive high-quality program from birth through 5, that it could change their life. And that we, every year we don't do that. Every year we lose on that opportunity is a year lost that these families won't get back. And so I think that there's a way of making sure that we are continuing to increase opportunities for families, especially families who need it most, while also protecting the ecosystem that makes the early childhood landscape what it is in Chicago.
I've got some ideas, but they'll be quick. Articulating a crystal clear vision with an execution plan for where we're headed. I'm not hearing that to everybody. Absolutely. I'm not hearing that. That's one. Number 2 is greater transparency and communication with providers on the ground. I think it's easy to ask and assume that you know the answer to a question, but there's a whole ripple effect unless you're getting true on the ground perspective. I think for the state level, one low-hanging thing that can happen right away is changing the child care eligibility rules and guidelines so that there's a more level playing field for community-based organizations. That would make a huge difference.
All right,
I'll stop
thank you.
there.
Great. So I'm going to give Cornelia the last word because I love her editorial comments. And so think about what you want to say. But just a couple last things. One, thank you. Thank you to our panelists for engaging in this conversation. Thank you for your energy in the room and the audience. Let's give them a round of applause. Second, this was something new we were trying to teach for America. We have not hosted conversations like these in quite some time, and it was really great to see how much energy and passion there was for these types of conversations. So stay tuned for additional invitations ongoing for more conversations like this. And then finally, I want to take the energy in the room to put out a call to action. Something we really pride ourselves on is having diverse perspectives in the room. And we started to get at some of that. We only had an hour, and so there's probably a whole day we could get on this. But not everyone agrees all the time on the path forward, and we think that's beautiful. We think that's healthy. And so channel and kind of take that energy and passion with you as you leave the room, and think about what commitment you want to make from where you are in your seat on this topic, on this issue of early childhood education, from whatever angle or vantage point you come at, because we need everyone involved and thinking about this work. So with that, Cornelia, do you want the last word, or are you okay? Okay, Cornelia is good. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.